Hi, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live broadcast on the release of the ISM Manufacturing PMI Report. My name is Dan Zeiger. I'm senior writer and editor for Inside Supply Management. That is the Institute for Supply Management's member publication. We're glad you've joined us as we discuss the Manufacturing PMI for January. Pitchers and catchers don't report to major league camps for a few more days, but we got our first knuckleball of the spring. The composite PMI made a big leap to 52.6%. The first time in expansion territory in a year, and the highest reading since August of 2022. There are some caveats that we'll discuss, and I've been following the ISM PMI reports for close to 10 years now, and I don't know if I've ever seen a report where the data and comments diverge like we saw in January. So let's bring in the best person to help us sort through this menagerie of data points. Her name is Susan Spence. She's the chair of the ISM Manufacturing Business Survey Committee. And while there was confidence expressed in the December supply chain planning forecast, Sue, as we've discussed, I don't think many saw this coming. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a sip of coffee while you tell us what stood out and what was surprising this month.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. Yeah, it was surprising. And then, as you read through the wonderful panelist comments and maybe think about what they said in December in the semi-forecast, maybe a little less surprising. I just think we didn't think we'd see expansion so soon, especially because we don't yet have a tariff ruling from the Supreme Court. Nonetheless, we are where we are. We say we'll take the win. And with the demand factors in expansion and customer inventory so super low, which we think has something to do with the order trigger, we will just, we'll keep an eye on it. I think you need a couple of months of this. That pipeline has to be filled from orders and new export orders more than just 1 month. We saw back in the late summer, early fall that a 1 month uptick, if it didn't get kept up, would, only last into the next month with sub-indices like production and backlog.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned the customers' inventories index in your introduction just now, and that seemed to be the linchpin in the January data. Now, it does not directly factor into the PMI, as students of the ISM PMI reports know, but it's kind of an important index because it does measure the product levels on shelves. And as we have discussed in recent months, customers have to reorder at some point, and it hit 38.7% in January. That was its lowest level since June of 22 when it was at 35.2%. Is this a reason, as you kind of alluded to, that we saw new orders and backlogs expanding?
I think it is. I think it's not a coincidence that it's the lowest point since I think it was June of 2022. And, depending on the lead time and the industry sector, I think that certainly can be true. In the past 3 or 4 months, our panelists has also said maybe more for the longer lead items like commercial vehicles, is that instead of, orders that span a great period of time, like I'm going to order a year's worth of something, maybe only 2 or 3 months worth, because I want to just let out as much as I must to keep my shelves stocked. Because that comes with a price. And that's if you're importing something from a country that has a tariff assessed, you want to maybe buy 2 months at a higher price versus 12 months at a higher price. So I've said throughout today, I think this Supreme Court ruling is very important. We know full well that if it is not in support of administration, that they will go to their, next level of, all right, how else can I assess a tariff, either with the 150-day rule or the commodity tariffs? But it is where it is. We'll take the win. And I am more interested in what happens in February and March, especially on those input factors.
Yeah. Yeah, the data point that stood out to me, that is the biggest indicator. Yeah, we need to wait another month, to see if this is lasting. 9.7 percentage point swing in the new orders index. It registered 57.1%. Someone pointed out on the Twitter today that, you take away the pandemic and that's the largest such swing since 2001. So this is a swing that does not happen often, and suggests that we need another month of data. And, you alluded in the report itself, you've got New Year reordering, post-holiday reordering you have to factor in, as we're going to talk about much in our half hour together. Companies probably trying to race to get ahead of tariffs. Those were dynamics that you have to consider as well. Just, talk about that whole picture as it relates to new orders.
Yeah. The sectors, whether they're facing a commodity tariff or a country tariff, if there's some kind of window for a customer to get in there beforehand, then that's what they're going to do. It's just, it's difficult to know when the right time is, but until your shelves are, like I said, so empty that now that's hitting your profit margin, maybe as a retailer or an ultimate customer. The other thing I'm going to look for as a turnaround is not only another month, but maybe another 2 or 3 months of sustained new orders. But when that employment number starts turning, when we start seeing at least, as many people hiring as not, right now, I think we're still at for every person hiring, there are 2 or that not. So I think about the employment index as that's kind of the longer maybe view indices, because, hiring someone, you got to hire them, you got to train them. And again, depending on the sector, that's an investment. So when companies are comfortable enough to start backfilling folks that have left, because they see it, they've got to do that because they see we see that the orders aren't just these 1 month upticks, that, we're getting maybe more of a normal view. So I'll feel better when, the demand factors stay in expansion for 2 to 3 months at least to start. But then when employment starts turning around as well. And then I think we're back to something that's healthier. And I think that's completely at the mercy of what happens with Supreme Court ruling and the administration's, behavior, if you will, after that. Where do they go next? We also talked this morning on several of the interviews about, what are customers outside of the U.S. doing in the meanwhile. And my opinion is several have told us, several panelists, like they're looking for somewhere else to go. And I remember when I was in the role both at United Technologies and at FedEx, if I had a supplier that was continually hiking prices on me, I could take it for a few months because the cost of trying to find another source was quite expensive. But after several months, then I felt like I had to mitigate the risk of year over year or month over month pricing hikes by biting the bullet, spending the money, or trying to convince my bosses to spend the money to let me go somewhere that was going to treat me better, that was friendlier. And I think that's exactly what you see. There's this great phrase I mention often: capital goes where it's treated well. Well, you're going to go where you're treated well. The added complexity, though, is you don't know which country is next to kind of have something assessed on them.
Right.
So it's difficult, but enough months at this, and customers will find a way to not be, so I guess impacted by our economic policy.
Sure. Yeah, we're going to drill down into that a little bit more in a bit, because as we have discussed in recent months, and it was certainly true this month as well, tariffs dominated the comments, and we will share one as as has been tradition here in recent months. But you talked, and I was just reminded, I had said that the PMI was the highest since August 2022. If you were wondering what it was that month, it was 53%. So I forgot to include that earlier. So thanks a lot, Christina. But talk about hoping to see signs of lasting improvement. And certainly the index I think you can look to the most and hope for a ray of sunshine there, a lasting ray of sunshine, is production. That is an index that, I pointed out not only with you, but with your predecessor, Tim Fiore, been very resilient over the, turbulence over the last 2 or 3 years. And it's been so in recent months. And is that the index to be most optimistic about, given that, the ordering in January, they got to do something with it at some point. So that should translate into a production boost in the future. Is that, maybe the reading that you can look at and be most optimistic about at this point?
Well, maybe normally, but I remember starting late last July, August, all the way through October, seeing the production index do kind of this, right? Up and down and up and down. So I think about the front of the pipe. The front of the pipe is new orders and new export orders. If that pipe is got a level above 50 in expansion and it stays that way, then production and backlog are going to kind of rise up and stay steady. But if you have production up, and sorry, I'm doing the hand gesture for those listening. If you have production high, but then new orders continue like they did in the fall to be, under 50 for several months, and what's there going to be to produce, right? So again, depending on the sector and the lead time, that production is not going to stay steady if it's not being fed by the front of the pipeline. So if there was one to look at for me, it would be new orders, new export orders, because everything should flow from there. Okay. And maybe as I think we're seeing now, the customer inventory index is the real leading indicator. Our panelists have some look at what's on their customer shelf, some maybe, better than others. But if that's the thing that triggers an order, and an order triggers the production triggers backlog, right? It's like the leg bone's connected to the knee bone. That's kind of how I think of it in a linear fashion here.
Yeah. Talking about the demand, you had noted in your calls earlier today that the respondent comments in respective to demand was a positive ratio there. But in general, there were still 2.3 negative comments for every positive comment. Yeah. And some of them, if you've read the reports, and we'll share one later, some of them were just doozies. Like I said, I've been following the reports for 10 years now. I never saw comments and data diverge as much as they have in January. How do you explain it?
Yeah, that's the question of the day. And maybe what isn't being said is, are you being a little harsh? Are you being a little pessimistic? I don't think so. What I like about the ratios, and they're inverse, right? Our general comments, positive, negative, 1 to 2.3. Demand, positive to negative, 2.1 to 1. It's almost the opposite. So I think the general sentiment is reflecting that we're still at 40% of our panelists talking about tariffs. And that's if they mention the word, right? There's other, inferences about tariffs. But some demand looking like it's coming back. The question of the day is that just because people have to, because they're so low in their inventory levels, are they ordering while they go find another country to buy from, or another manufacturing in somewhere where they're not being treated as badly with these price hikes? It is not a declaration. That's the question. And the answer is we will see with what happens in the next several months. So, hopefully we'll get some certainty around economic policy that is one that will attract customers to do, to keep our economy strong, order from us. And, it's really all about pricing and what risk they're willing to take, or, how often do they think the economic policy will change? Will it constantly change month over month? Is it a negotiation tactic with a real negative economic impact? That's the worry.
Well, let's talk about a comment in specific, a specific comment. And tariffs were the dominant subject, and a panelist in machinery wrote, continuing softness in the market with December orders below average and buyers reluctant to spend despite beneficial tax policies in the U.S. Geopolitical tensions are fueling anti-American buyer sentiment, and sales are being lost. I mean, I know you touched on that a little bit earlier, but yeah, just expand on that a little bit, in terms of what some of those respondents could be feeling.
Yeah, I like the comment, not because it's positive, but because this panelist rolled a whole lot in here. We get asked about the big, beautiful bill and the tax policies. We sometimes get asked about, what have the interest rates cut? What have they done for us? And basically the whole reluctant to spend despite, right? And I take away from that, the tariffs are so overwhelmingly harmful, not in themselves because there's a increase, because one could argue that, the proper use of that is to kind of level the playing field, but because they're punitive in some cases, they seem to be, some would say, a punishment for countries that, for whatever reason, aren't supporting us. but because they are coming and going, right? This is what we're going to do. No, we're not, but we're going to do that if you don't do this. And it's that uncertainty we've been saying since May. Business people don't like it because they can't plan around it.
Mm-hmm.
And if they for sure aren't understanding what's going to happen to their profit margin because they don't know what's going to happen to their input costs. And, for those in the procurement field, everywhere I've worked in my major suppliers, you have a revenue number and your spend is typically half or more of that. It matters and it impacts it. So that's going to continue to be the story. And I don't think, an amount of interest rate cutting and beneficial tax policies for corporations is going to overcome that huge tariff impact.
Yeah. Well, let's just camp there or stay there. You mentioned the potential decision that could be coming. It keeps being delayed, or at least later than a lot of people were anticipating, the decision by the Supreme Court. But even as you pointed out, even if they do something to strike down a lot of them, the administration is going to have a plan B. And you noted at some point in an earlier interview today, companies are going to have to take determine whether they're going to devote the time and especially the investment to move sourcing and production, and the impact those decisions will have on customers in terms of pricing. Those are dynamics, as you said, you had to consider in your career. Just discuss that process, especially I imagine I wasn't in those shoes, you were, but I imagine that's got to be, especially difficult, especially if the trade picture stays as muddy as what we got right now.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't go through this tariff chaos when I was in the role, but I remember feeling helpless with certain suppliers. In this case, in aerospace, it was suppliers that, had intellectual property and we were locked into their design, and they could do anything they wanted. They could hike prices because they knew, or they felt that, as a customer, you just weren't going to spend the money to go resource or reverse engineer or whatever it was you did. And I remember being frustrated, maybe with my own management chain, that, so we're at the mercy of pricing from the supplier that, we've locked in their design. We did that, and now we're not being treated well. How much more are we going to take? How many, price hikes are we going to take, or delivery disruptions, before we will finally say the cost of that is real? And it's every bit as much as, the cost of reinvesting in another source in another country. And so the question is, are customers there yet? Right? If I'm going to have to deal now I'm pretending I'm a customer. If I'm going to have to deal with, taking it in the teeth on a profit margin and not knowing what to expect and having to run around my company and cut costs in other ways, that's got a bigger cost than maybe, the cost of going somewhere else that's friendlier. Maybe I can strike a more beneficial contract. I don't think companies and customers were there last June or July. They might be now. Mm-hmm. And perhaps, I'm speculating, if the Supreme Court does rule and say you can't do what you've been doing with the Emergency Powers Act, perhaps that'll give people a little more comfort, even though we do know there's other ways to get tariffs, right? Mm-hmm. Is that the best result for the U.S.? Well, if we want to stay strong, because we're strong and we're generally expanding, but people have to be able to count on us and want to do business with us. And if they don't, as this panelist indicated, they're only going to buy as much as they have to for a short period of time until they can go elsewhere and get treated better. That's my feeling, and that's how I would feel if I were in the role.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to share another comment from a respondent in transportation equipment, because it leads perfectly into my next question for Sue. It's the first comment that was listed on the report, and the last sentence, or last couple of sentences, says, as we enter 2026, every conversation revolves around hope that the second half of 2026 starts the turnaround. It's hard to set strategy on hope, but thanks to the uncertainty brought about by this administration, here we are. That was a respondent in transportation equipment. I brought that comment up because in the analysis that you, or the interviews that you've done earlier today, and even in our conversation, we've talked about a lot of maybes. And as you put it, when you were asked, I don't like to answer a question with a question, but that's what we have to do sometimes. That's where we are. Yeah. You can talk about whatever, other data points you want, but the thing that stands out to me with that dynamic was the employment index. I mean, it was up, but it stayed in contraction, 48.1%. And you see the new orders and the impact it could have on production and hopefully on hiring. But that's only hope at this point, correct?
Right. Right. And employment is one to watch too. I guess you could say that's the ultimate lagging indicator, because people can hope all they want, but if you're certainly, and I've said this before, if you are not sure that orders are going to continue to creep up in production, you're not going to spend money hiring people that you might have to turn around 3 months later and lay off. You're going to do your best to work with the staff that you have so that you don't have that issue. And there's such a cost to training folks. I pay a lot of attention, especially to transportation equipment, not because I came from transportation services, but, we always have said trucking and commercial vehicles moving goods around this country and the services that a UPS and a FedEx provide are leading indicators for a lot of things. If goods are moving and there's high economic activity, we're going to see it first in those industries. So, for the customers of transportation equipment to not order or live another year or two with their fleet, because they're not sure what's going to happen to that economic cycle. It's very telling. We talk about chemical products as being, not only the single biggest contributor to the manufacturing sector GDP wise, but it's because it goes in so many things. Well, it was an expansion like a lot of the big six this month. But perhaps if we see several months with that particular industry, and if we start to see transportation equipment turn around, maybe we hope, but those are indicators, right? To me, they're indicators. I hope this is the year that things start to turn around. I think it's going to take a while because as we've said before, even if things go the right way, some people feel they should, to be more economical, stable, it's going to take a while for people to believe that it isn't going to change again. Yeah. Because that's what we were taught last year is, you could be shocked at a policy that comes out, but, just hang on and wait because it's probably going to be different in a month. And that's not a good place to be.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I know this is a question that I typically ask you. I think it's especially relevant this month. I mean, we've, CEOs, high executives, C-suites. I mean, they've had to deal with the dynamics that we've been talking about in recent months with trade and whatnot. And those things were expected. And, we had this report that dropped today, and I don't think a lot of people expected that just in light of that. And, maybe it was a little unexpected. If I'm a CEO and, I'm in the C-suite, what do I take away from this report?
Watch carefully, take in the information, read and study everything you can. I'm not saying call your Congress anymore. I said that for a few months, but, study your options too. Right. I just don't know with these kind of huge tariff numbers that have been talked about, how much more could be done. But if folks aren't already talking to their customer and ask, what's it going to take for you to feel more confident, they'll give us 12 months worth of orders versus 3. I got to believe they're already doing that. But I think, probably by now, January 26th, there's been a lot done already to say, where else could we preserve capital, save money, do the things we have to do to weather this storm. Right. But it's difficult. It's difficult. And I think they just have to understand what their customer, what are the triggers for their customer, what's going to happen and what's in their control, because I think it feels that so much is not in their control, which is really not a good place to be, not a fun place to be for sure.
Yeah. Well, I usually ask this with a couple questions or with a couple minutes left, but we got about 5. We got some time to expand on this a little bit. So, I'm diving back into the data table here. I mean, before I ask you if there was anything that we haven't discussed that, you might want to include, I mean, some indexes that we haven't talked about. I mean, prices, not a whole lot of movement there, just up to, a half a percentage point to 59. And the export and import indexes had some significant movement. The export was in contraction. The imports had an unchanged. I mean, anything in the data, any index that we haven't talked about at this point that, you might want to shed some light on.
Yeah, I mean, we hit the highlights. I mean, import is right at that baseline of 50. So that's interesting. That one, I guess I wouldn't expect it to go a whole lot higher while the tariff question is still open. I do think it was interesting, and this is not in the report, but it's part of the kind of outside research I do, the University of Michigan Customer Sentiment Index, right? So it crept up a bit, which made sense given the numbers that we're seeing in our own report, but it's still, they have an index of consumer sentiment, current economic conditions and expectations, which is like future. It's still down 24 to 30% from this time last year, but it crept up, right? Last month, 52.9 for the consumer sentiment. Now it's 54. So it's crept up a bit, and we'll see if that one holds as well. And, I think that's certainly how customers are feeling in general. You look at inflation with that, and you look at unemployment with that as well. So I remind people we still have an overall expanding economy. It was strong a year ago. How much damage has been done by the economic policy chaos that we've been going on, and how much longer can it go on for before it starts to do some damage that we can't recover easily from, is, again, the question with the question. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Well, yeah, as we've talked about throughout this call, I mean, I think that, you need more than 1 month to make a trend, and the data for the next month should tell the story. And, the greatest news is we're in the shortest month of the year. So we get to see the new data a couple days sooner than normal. So, yeah, I'll kind of phrase, the last question that I usually ask in those terms. I mean, anything that we haven't discussed, and, especially in light of, we want to see what, if this becomes a trend, just, what are you going to be thinking about or looking for in the next month, in terms of, where the direction the manufacturing sector is heading.
I think the one thing we haven't talked about, but I believe this figure was published since our last month, the GDP growth, I think the final for Q3 was up 4.3, and that surprised people, and they were really excited and hurrying. And, I think that the thing that gets lost is that imports come out of that. And so imports have been so low. So if you have, if you have 100 for a GDP number and normally 10 for imports, then you're at 90. But if imports are really low, as they have been, it's only at 5, then it looks better than it might be. So I just want to remind people of that. So did we really have the GDP growth everyone talks about, or is it artificially high because imports have been so low? So let's see what happens for the final Q4 number. I'm not sure when that's published, probably sometime next month. I think we pretty much covered just about everything. This report, as surprising as it may be to some, I think next month will even be more interesting to see if we have a trend here or another big bubble. And I'm really hoping when we sit here next month, we'll have some finality, at least with the round of the Emergency Economic Powers Act and what the Supreme Court says can be done and not.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's a lot to look forward to. And yeah, like I said, we'll get to talk a couple of days sooner than we normally do. So looking forward to it.
All right.
Hey, thanks a lot, Susan. And thanks to you for joining us today. Be with us on Wednesday when we break down the Services PMI report for January with Steve Miller. He's the chair of ISM's Services Business Survey Committee. And if you'd like to be a part of the ISM Manufacturing or Services Business Survey panels that help compile data for the ISM PMI reports, visit ismworld.org/join the panel for more information. So for Sue Spence and the people who helped us behind the scenes, they are Christina Cahill and Jennifer Stevens. I'm Dan Zeiger, and we'll see you on Wednesday.